So for next slide is about determine the taxpayers category. It will be based on the financial year 2022 from one of these taxpayer document. First, will be based on audited financial statement. Second one is based on 4 non-audited financial account. We will refer to tax return year assessment 2022. If there a case of change of equity period for 2022 financial year, we will refer to annual income or sales and prorate for the year to determine mandatory timeline. Any changes to annual income or sales in subsequent years will not change the taxpayer responsibility to implement e-invoice based on the specified implementation timeline. And the new company or business registered in 2023, we start implementing e-invoice at 1st July 2025. How will the taxpayer submit their invoice? There are 2 ways of doing it. First is direct login to My Invoice portal developed by LHDN. In this portal, taxpayer can issue, send, review, cancel, or reject invoices. You can also view and search e-invoice transaction received by LHDN. Or the second one, integrate your system using API to send your e-invoice over to LHDN. Of course, to do this, you will need to check your existing system compatibility to integrate, then also to determine your system whether to direct connect to LHDN or using third-party API. To date, there are 55 data fields required for e-invoice to be submitted to LHDN for validation. The white data fields are mandatory, while color fields are optional. So as businesses, you need to make sure that you capture all the information during your commercial transaction to avoid rejection when you submit your e-invoice. In certain cases, an annex will be required to be submitted as part of the e-invoice to LHDN with additional 12 data fields. For example, the import and export transaction or goods are shipped to a different place. Next slide is about key changes made to the invoice guideline and also the specific guideline version 2.0. In the later version of the guideline released by LHDN on February 9, 2024, several key changes has been made to improve clarity, provide better guidance, and enhance understanding of the certain transaction. These changes aim to provide clear and comprehensive guidance for implementing e-invoicing in Malaysia. You may visit to our e-invoice microsite for this latest guideline. Also, LHDN has provided industry-specific FAQ. By providing this specific FAQ, LHDN can support business in different sectors in understanding and navigating the complexity of e-invoicing, ultimately facilitating a smoother transition to e-invoice and compliance with regulatory requirements. You may also find this industry-specific FAQ at our microsite e-invoice. Before we take a short break, we go through my invoice system for next slide. This is the overview of e-invoice workflow, my invoice portal. The flow will start from the initial point of sales until the issuance of e-invoice between supplier, buyer, and LHDN. This slide shows the overview of the API option, where the taxpayer can transmit directly either from your ERP system or through a service provider, be it a PayPal access point or a non-PayPal service provider. Okay, I will go through this step by step. First step is the creation and submission of e-invoice. This slide outlines the two options available for taxpayers to submit e-invoice. Okay, for option A, supplier can use the My-Invoice portal through two methods, either creating e-invoice individually or in batches for LHDN validation process. For option B, the supplier or technology provider create an invoice in specified format, XML or JSON, and submit it to LHDN via API. Step 2 is validation of e-invoice. Upon successful validation, the supplier will receive the validated e-invoice in PDF together with a RIBM unique identifier number. This unique identifier number is for traceability purpose and to mitigate the risk of tampering the e-invoice. If the validation is unsuccessful, the system will return the unvalidated e-invoice with error message to the supplier. The supplier needs to amend the e-invoice accordingly and resubmit it. Step 3 is notification for e-invoice. At the same time, upon successful validation, LHDN will also send an email notification to both supplier and buyer to inform that the invoice has been validated. It only carries notification message. No file will be attached with this notification. Step 4 is sharing of e-invoice. Once validated, supplier is required to share the validated e-invoice with the buyer. LHDN will provide validated link in a QR code to the supplier, and the supplier need to embed this QR code first before sharing the validated e-invoice with the buyer. Step 5 until 7 will be a rejection and cancellation of e-invoice. After the validation by LHDN, supplier and buyer can make requests for rejection or cancellation to the validated e-invoice within 72 hours. If the buyer requests for rejection, buyer must specify the reason for rejection, example, wrongly written address, incomplete items listed. The supplier will then receive a notification. On the other hand, supplier can also cancel the invoice within 72 hours. The supplier needs to give justification of the cancellation. A notification will be sent to the buyer. If no rejection or cancellation within 72 hours, the e-invoice will be deemed as correct and automatically accepted. Any adjustment afterward must be made by issuing a new invoice, such as debit note, credit note, or refund invoice. Step 8 is storing invoice by LHDN. The data of all submitted invoice will be securely stored in LHDN database. However, taxpayers are advised to maintain adequate record and documentation related to the transaction at the end for future reference. Step 9 is reporting and dashboard services for taxpayers. Both the supplier and buyer may request the retrieve invoice data in various formats, including XML or JSON, metadata, CSV report, grid, or PDF file in My-Invoice portal. So we stop here for the short break before we continue for next slide. I pass to you, Cik Azlin. Okay, terima kasih, Cik Azlin. Okay, for this second half, we will explore into the specific guideline that has been updated by